Margaret Maggie Thompson pulled her worn leather flight jacket tighter as she walked across the tarmac at Riverside Municipal Airport. The California sun beat down mercilessly, but the whispers and snickers from the group of young pilots near the hangar sent a different kind of chill through her bones. At 72, she had grown accustomed to the stares, but today felt different. Today, the mockery seemed louder, more pointed. "Look at that old bird trying to fly that antique," one of the pilots said, not bothering to lower his voice. His companions erupted in laughter, their designer flight suits and expensive aviator sunglasses catching the afternoon light. They leaned against their sleek modern aircraft, all-glass cockpits and digital displays, looking like they had stepped out of a recruitment poster. "Someone should tell Grandma that museums are for looking." "Not flying?" another added, gesturing toward Maggie's aircraft with obvious disdain. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not on a runway." The object of their ridicule sat quietly on the tarmac, her paint faded and her metal skin bearing the honest wear of decades in the sky. She was a North American P-51 Mustang, her silver aluminum body dulled by time and weather, her propeller blades showing the nicks and scratches of countless hours cutting through clouds. To the casual observer, she looked tired, perhaps even dangerous. Her landing gear seemed fragile compared to the robust tricycle configurations of the modern jets nearby. Her round engine cowling and bubble canopy spoke of a different era, when flying was as much about courage as it was about technology. Maggie ran her weathered hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets and seams beneath her palm. Each dent and scratch told a story, held a memory. The young pilots saw only an old woman and an older plane, but they couldn't see the history written in the metal, couldn't read the stories etched into every panel and wire. "Ma'am, are you sure you should be flying that thing?" The airport manager had approached, his face creased with genuine concern. "I mean, no disrespect, but those old warbirds require a lot of maintenance. And at your age—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable but feeling obligated to speak up. Maggie smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with something the manager couldn't quite identify. "I appreciate your concern, son, but this old girl and I understand each other just fine." She patted the aircraft's side affectionately. "We've been through worse than a few smart-mouthed kids and a hot afternoon." The manager glanced nervously at the group of younger pilots who had now attracted a small crowd of onlookers. Phone cameras were already out, ready to capture what they assumed would be either a disaster or at least a good laugh for social media. The contrast was stark. On one side, youth and modern technology. On the other, age and what appeared to be obsolete machinery. "I just don't want any trouble," the manager continued. "These vintage aircraft, they're unpredictable. And if something happens—" "The only thing that's going to happen," Maggie interrupted gently, "is that I'm going to take her up for a little flight? Just like I have hundreds of times before." She began her pre-flight inspection, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Her movements were confident, purposeful, checking control surfaces, examining the propeller, testing the tension on cables. The crowd was growing larger now. Word had spread through the small airport community about the elderly woman and her ancient airplane. Some came out of genuine concern, others drawn by the prospect of witnessing either triumph or disaster. The younger pilots had made no effort to hide their amusement, and their commentary had attracted even more attention. $50 says she can't even get it started," one of them wagered loudly. "I'll take that bet," another replied. "But I'm betting she gets it started and then chickens out before takeoff." Maggie continued her inspection, seemingly oblivious to the growing spectacle around her. She checked the oil level, examined the exhaust stacks, and tested the elevator and rudder controls. Every movement was deliberate and professional, but the crowd saw only an old woman fussing over an ancient machine, the Mustang's registration. Number was clearly visible on her side, but in the shadows cast by her wing it was difficult to read clearly from a distance. The faded paint and accumulated grime of years made the letters and numbers blend into the weathered aluminum. To most observers it was just another tail number. Meaningless digits and letters required by aviation authorities. As Maggie completed her external inspection and prepared to climb into the cockpit. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some expressed genuine worry for her safety, while others seemed to be placing informal bets on the outcome. The younger pilots had positioned themselves for the best view, their phones ready to record what they were certain would be an embarrassing failure. "This is going to be good," one of them said, adjusting his position for a better angle. "Wait until the guys back at the squadron see this." Maggie paused at the wing root, one foot on the first step of the boarding ladder. She looked back at the crowd, her expression calm and composed. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not fear or uncertainty, but something deeper, something that spoke of experiences and knowledge far beyond what any of the spectators could imagine. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the tarmac. The wind was light and steady, perfect flying conditions. As Maggie prepared to climb into the cockpit, she took one last look at her audience. Soon enough, they would understand that there was much more to this story than an old woman and an old airplane. Soon enough, they would learn that sometimes the most extraordinary stories come in the most ordinary packages. Maggie climbed into the cockpit with surprising agility, her movements fluid and confident despite her age. The interior of the Mustang was a time capsule from another era, filled with analog gauges, toggle switches, and mechanical controls that seemed primitive compared to the digital displays of modern aircraft. She settled into the worn leather seat, her hands automatically finding their positions on the familiar controls. The crowd had grown larger, now numbering nearly 30 people. Airport maintenance workers had stopped their duties to watch. Pilots from other aircraft had emerged from their hangars, and even some passengers waiting for flights had gathered near the windows of the terminal building. The younger pilots continued their commentary, their voices carrying clearly across the tarmac in the still afternoon air. "Look at all those old gauges," one of them said, squinting to see into the cockpit. "How does anyone fly with all that? Analog junk? It's like trying to drive a Model T on the freeway. Probably doesn't even have GPS," another added. "She get lost before she clears the pattern." Maggie methodically began her engine start procedure, her movements precise and deliberate. She adjusted her headset, checked the fuel mixture, and ensured the propeller was clear. Each action was performed with the muscle memory of decades, but to the observers, it looked like an elderly woman struggling with antiquated equipment. The airport manager had positioned himself near the aircraft, radio in hand, ready to contact the control tower if needed. His face showed clear anxiety as he watched Maggie work through her checklist. Several other airport personnel had gathered nearby, their expressions ranging from concern to frank curiosity about what would happen next. "Clear prop," Maggie called out loudly, her voice carrying the authority of long experience. The crowd stepped back instinctively, even those who had been skeptical recognizing the serious tone in her voice. She engaged the starter, and the massive Merlin engine began to turn over. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that shook the ground and rattled windows across the airport. The sound was unlike anything the modern jets could produce, raw, powerful, and unmistakably aggressive. Blue flame shot from the exhaust stacks as the engine settled into a steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone present. The crowd's demeanor began to shift slightly. The sheer power of the engine was undeniable, and even the most skeptical observers had to admit there was something impressive about the way the old aircraft came to life. The younger pilots stopped, laughing quite so loudly, though they continued their commentary. "Okay, so she got it started," one conceded. "But starting and flying are two different things. Those old radial engines are temperamental. One wrong move and it'll quit on her." "And even if it doesn't quit," another added, "how's she going to handle that much power?" Those old fighters were built for young, strong pilots, not grandmothers. Maggie sat calmly in the cockpit, allowing the engine to warm up properly. She monitored the oil pressure and temperature gauges, watching for the steady readings that would indicate the Merlin was ready for flight. Her hands rested lightly on the controls, and her eyes scanned the instruments with the practiced efficiency of a pilot who had been reading these same types of gauges for more than 50 years. As the engine warmed, she tested the controls, moving the stick and rudder pedals to check the response of the flight surfaces. The Mustang's ailerons, elevator, and rudder moved obediently, their cables and pulleys operating smoothly despite their age. She cycled the flaps and checked the trim tabs, each system responding exactly as it should. The radio crackled to life, and the control tower's voice filled her headset. November 7742 Fox, Riverside Tower, we have you ready for taxi. Advise when ready for departure. The tail number in 7742F was clearly audible to anyone monitoring the radio frequency, but in the noise and excitement of the moment, most of the crowd wasn't paying attention to the specific call sign. They were focused on the spectacle before them, the sight of an elderly woman preparing to fly a warplane that was older than most of their parents. Tower 7742 Fox is ready to taxi, Maggie responded, her voice professional and calm over the radio. She began to move the aircraft forward, the Mustang rolling smoothly across the tarmac toward the active runway. The crowd followed. At a distance, some jogging to keep up with the aircraft as it moved toward the departure point. The younger pilots had their phones out, recording everything, already composing the social media posts that would accompany their videos of what they expected to be either a disaster or an embarrassing display of poor airmanship. This is going to be epic, one of them said, adjusting his phone's camera angle. Wait until everyone sees this. Ancient pilot, ancient plane, what could go wrong? As Maggie taxied, she performed her pre-takeoff checks with mechanical precision. Engine temperatures and pressures were all in the green ranges. Flight controls moved freely and correctly. The radio was functioning properly and the aircraft systems all showed normal operation. Everything was exactly as it should be, but the crowd saw only an old woman struggling with an obsolete machine at the hold short line Maggie brought the Mustang to a stop and contacted the tower for takeoff clearance. The wind was calm, the sky clear, and traffic was light, perfect conditions for what she had planned. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pre-flight excitement that had never diminished despite her thousands of hours in the air. 742 Fox, Riverside Tower, you are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Wind calm, altimeter 3012. Contact departure on 124.75 when airborne. Cleared for takeoff runway 27, contact departure 12475. 7742 Fox, Maggie acknowledged. She taxied onto the runway, aligning the aircraft with the centerline, and pushed the throttle forward smoothly. The Merlin engine's roar increased to a crescendo that could be heard for miles around the airport. The crowd watched in fascination and trepidation as the old fighter began its takeoff roll, wondering what they were about to witness. The Mustang accelerated down the runway with surprising grace, her tail wheel lifting off the ground as Maggie skillfully managed the aircraft's tendency to swing left from the massive torque of the propeller. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the old fighter picked up speed, her engine note changing from a rumble to a full-throated roar that echoed off the hangars and terminal buildings. What happened next defied every expectation. The spectators had formed. Instead of a labored, uncertain takeoff, the Mustang leaped into the air with the eagerness of a thoroughbred racehorse. Maggie's control inputs were smooth and precise, the aircraft responding to her touch as if it were an extension of her own body. The landing gear retracted cleanly, and the fighter began to climb with a rate that impressed even the skeptical younger pilots. "Did you see that?" one of them said, lowering his phone slightly. "She got that thing off the ground like it weighed nothing." "Lucky," another muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier comments. "Let's see if she can actually fly it." As if responding to their challenge, Maggie began to demonstrate exactly what she and the old Mustang were capable of. At 500 feet above the ground, she rolled the aircraft into a smooth, climbing turn that showcased the fighter's legendary maneuverability. The turn was perfect, coordinated, precise, and executed with the kind of skill that comes only from years of experience with high performance aircraft. The crowd on the ground had grown quiet, their initial amusement replaced by something approaching awe. This was not the fumbling amateur performance they had expected. This was airmanship of the highest order, the kind of flying that spoke of deep knowledge and hard-won expertise. The airport manager, who had been nervously clutching his radio, began to relax slightly. Whatever he had expected when he saw the elderly woman approaching the vintage fighter, it wasn't this display of smooth, professional flying. His concerns about safety and liability were beginning to give way to genuine admiration for what he was witnessing. At 1,500 feet, Maggie leveled off and began what pilots call slow flight, deliberately reducing the aircraft's speed while maintaining precise altitude and heading control. The Mustang's nose rose slightly as she decreased power and increased the angle of attack, but the aircraft remained rock-steady under her control. This was one of the most challenging aspects of flying, requiring constant attention and delicate control inputs, especially in a high-performance fighter aircraft. "Look at that," said an older mechanic who had emerged from one of the hangars. "She's got that bird singing. You don't see flying like that very often. Not even from the young hotshots." The younger pilots had stopped their commentary, their phones still recording, but their expressions growing more serious as they watched Maggie's demonstration. What they were seeing was not the work of a lucky amateur, but the skill of a master pilot. Every control input was purposeful, every maneuver executed with precision that spoke of deep familiarity with the aircraft and its capabilities. Maggie increased power and began a series of gentle S-turns, the Mustang banking left and right in smooth, coordinated movements that made the heavy fighter look as graceful as a dancer. The aircraft's shadow swept across the airport grounds below, passing over the crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch what they thought would be a spectacle of incompetence. From the cockpit, Maggie could see the entire scene spread out below her. The modern jets on the tarmac looked like toys from her vantage point, their sleek lines and sophisticated technology impressive, but somehow lacking the character and personality of the aircraft she was flying. She had flown modern jets, had trained on glass cockpits and computer-controlled systems, but there was something special about the direct connection between pilot and machine that the old fighters provided. The radio crackled in her headset. 7742 Fox, you have some beautiful flying up there. What are your intentions? Thank you, Tower. 7742 Fox requests to remain in the pattern for a few minutes if traffic permits. I'd like to show some folks what this old girl can do. 7742 Fox, pattern approved, traffic permitting. We have several people here in the tower who are quite impressed with your airwork. As if to punctuate the controller's comment, Maggie began a series of maneuvers that demonstrated both her skill and the Mustang's capabilities. She performed a perfect loop, the aircraft tracing a smooth circle in the sky with the precision of a compass drawing. At the top of the loop, briefly inverted with the ground above her head. She maintained perfect control and emerged from the maneuver exactly on her original heading. The crowd below had grown completely silent. Several people had their hands over their mouths in amazement. The younger pilots had stopped recording and were simply staring at the display of aerobatic skill being performed above them. Even they had to admit that what they were watching was exceptional flying by any standard. Where did she learn to fly like that? One of them finally asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know, another replied. But she's making us all look like student pilots. Maggie followed the loop with a series of rolls, the Mustang rotating around its longitudinal axis with mechanical precision. 1 roll, 2 rolls, 4 rolls in succession, each one perfectly coordinated and smoothly executed. The aircraft seemed to be dancing in the sky, celebrating its return to its natural element, after what had clearly been too long on the ground. As she completed the final roll and leveled off, Maggie keyed her radio again. Tower, 7742 Fox is ready to return to the field. Requesting straight-in approach to runway 27. 7742 Fox, cleared straight-in approach runway 27. That was quite a show, ma'am. Wind calm, altimeter 3012. The crowd began to move back toward the landing area, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten. They had come to watch what they thought would be an embarrassing failure, but instead they had witnessed a masterclass in precision flying. As the Mustang began its approach, everyone wanted to be there when this remarkable woman returned to Earth. The Mustang's approach was a thing of beauty, executed with the precision of a surgical instrument. Maggie brought the fighter down in a shallow, stable descent, her airspeed and glide path perfect for the runway conditions. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she configured the aircraft for landing, extending the landing gear and adjusting the flaps with timing that spoke of thousands of hours of experience. As she crossed the runway threshold, the Mustang's wheels touched down so smoothly that the crowd barely heard the contact with the pavement. There was no bounce, no swerve, no indication of the difficulties that many pilots experience when landing high-performance tailwheel aircraft. The touchdown was greased on, as pilots say, with the kind of finesse that makes landing a complex fighter aircraft look effortless. The younger pilots stood in stunned silence as Maggie taxied back to her parking spot. Their earlier mockery had evaporated completely, replaced by something approaching reverence for what they had just witnessed. Several of them began to approach the aircraft as it came to a stop, their expressions showing a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. As the engine shut down and the propeller windmilled to a stop, the crowd began to gather around the Mustang. The airport manager was among the first to reach the aircraft, his face showing amazement and not a little embarrassment for his earlier concerns. "Ma'am, that was absolutely incredible," he said as Maggie began to climb down from the cockpit. "I have to apologize for my earlier comments. I've been around aircraft all my life and I've never seen flying like that." Maggie smiled as she stepped down to the tarmac, removing her headset and flight gloves with the same methodical care she had shown throughout the entire flight. "No need to apologize, son. I understand your concerns. Not everyone who climbs into an old warbird knows what they're doing." One of the younger pilots, the one who had been most vocal in his criticism, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology too. I said some things that were out of line. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. Where did you learn to handle a Mustang like that?" Before Maggie could answer, an elderly man in a veteran's cap pushed through the crowd. He had been watching from near the terminal building, and his face showed recognition that the others had not yet achieved. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Could I ask you to tell me that tail number again?" Maggie looked at him with interest, noting the military bearing that age had not completely erased, and the way his eyes were fixed on the aircraft's registration numbers. "November 7742 Fox," she said clearly. The old veteran's face went completely white. He stared at the faded numbers on the Mustang's fuselage for a long moment, then looked back at Maggie with an expression of disbelief. "And 7742F," he repeated slowly. "I know those numbers. I flew behind that aircraft in 1944. A murmur went through the crowd as people began to realize that something significant was happening. The veteran approached the aircraft with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space, his weathered hand reaching out to touch the aluminum skin he remembered from more than 70 years ago. "This is Sweet Carolyn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was the lead ship in our squadron. I was flying Mustang number 7751 in the 357th Fighter Group. We flew escort missions over Germany together." The younger pilots looked at each other in confusion, not yet understanding the full significance of what the veteran was saying. But the older members of the crowd began to grasp the implications. If this was indeed a World War II combat veteran aircraft, then the woman who had just demonstrated such masterful flying skills had a story to tell. Maggie nodded slowly, her own expression becoming more serious. "The 357th Fighter Group, the Oxford boys. You flew out of Leiston, England. Your squadron mates called you Lucky Peterson because you brought your bird home from 32 missions without a scratch." The veteran's knees nearly buckled. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice shaking with emotion. "Because, Lucky," Maggie said gently, "I was there too." The crowd fell completely silent. The implications of her words were beginning to sink in, but many of the spectators were still struggling to understand what they were hearing. The idea that this elderly woman could have been present during World War II combat operations seemed impossible to their modern sensibilities. "That's impossible," one of the younger pilots said. "Women didn't fly fighters in World War II. Everyone knows that." Maggie turned to face him, her blue eyes holding depths of experience that suddenly seemed much more profound than anyone had initially realized. "You're right about one thing, son. Women didn't fly fighters in combat for the United States military during World War II. But that doesn't mean women didn't fly fighters during the war." The veteran, tears now streaming down his weathered cheeks, stepped closer to Maggie. "You're WASP," he said, using the acronym for the Women Air Force Service Pilots. "You ferried aircraft from the factories to the bases. I remember now there were women pilots who delivered the new Mustangs to our squadron. But how do you know my story?" "Because I delivered this very aircraft to your squadron in December 1944, Maggie replied. "It was my job to fly new fighters. From the North American factory in California to the ports on the East Coast, where they were loaded onto ships and sent to England. But this one was special. She was held back for modifications, and I was selected to fly her directly to Leiston." The crowd was now hanging on every word. The arrogant young pilots who had been mocking an old woman and her ancient aircraft were beginning to understand that they were in the presence of living history. The implications of what they were hearing were staggering. "I remember you," the veteran said suddenly. "Lieutenant Thompson. You were the WASP pilot who delivered our new birds. You stayed for 3 days while they sorted out some paperwork problem. You were the one who showed us those modifications to the fuel system that saved gas on long flights." Maggie smiled, the years seeming to fall away from her face. "I remember you too, Lucky. You were the young pilot who kept asking me if I was really qualified to fly a P-51. You couldn't believe that a woman could handle a fighter aircraft." The irony was not lost on anyone present. 78 years later, a new generation of pilots had been asking the same question, and they had just received the same answer that Lucky Peterson had gotten in 1944. The revelation that Maggie had been a WASP pilot during World War II sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. The younger pilots, who had been so dismissive just an hour earlier, now found themselves face to face with a piece of living aviation history that they had never expected to encounter. The reality of what they had witnessed began to take on an entirely different meaning. "Ma'am," one of the younger pilots said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you mean you actually flew fighters during the war? Like for real combat missions?" Maggie shook her head gently. "Not combat missions, son? The WASP weren't allowed to fly combat. But we flew every other kind of mission you can imagine. We ferried aircraft from factories to bases, we towed targets for gunnery practice, we tested repaired aircraft, and we delivered new planes to squadrons heading overseas. We did everything except pull the trigger in combat." Lucky Peterson, still emotional from the reunion, stepped closer to the aircraft and ran his hand along the fuselage. "I flew wing on this bird for 6 months, he said. "She saved my life more times than I can count. The Jerrys threw everything they had at us, but Carolyn always brought us home." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for details about an era that seemed both distant and immediate. The modern airport around them faded into the background as these two veterans shared memories of a time when the world hung in the balance and young pilots flew dangerous missions in aircraft. Like the one standing before them. "How many aircraft did you deliver during the war?" asked one of the mechanics who had been working on the modern jets nearby. "Over 400, Maggie replied matter-of-factly. "Everything from primary trainers to heavy bombers. But the fighters were always my favorite. They had personality, each one different from the others. This one," she patted the Mustang's wing, "was special even then. She had modifications that made her faster and more fuel-efficient than the standard production models." "What kind of modifications?" asked one of the younger pilots, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. Maggie opened an inspection panel near the engine cowling and pointed to several components that looked different from standard Mustang configurations. enhanced fuel injection system, modified supercharger, and some aerodynamic improvements that reduced drag. The engineers were always experimenting, trying to give our boys every advantage they could get. Lucky nodded in agreement. That's right. Carolyn was faster than any of the other Mustangs in our squadron. We could outrun anything the Luftwaffe had, and when we needed to catch up to the bombers after a dogfight, she had the legs to get us there. The airport manager, who had been listening in fascination, suddenly realized the historical significance of what was parked on his tarmac. Mrs. Thompson, are you saying this is an actual World War II combat veteran aircraft? Not just a restored example, but an original? That she is, Maggie confirmed. After the war, she was surplused and sold to civilian buyers. She changed hands several times, spent some years crop dusting in Texas, then sat in a barn in Montana for 30 years. I tracked her down about 15 years ago and have been slowly restoring her to her original configuration. You've been restoring her yourself? Asked one of the younger pilots, incredulous. Most of it, Maggie replied with a smile. When you've spent your life around aircraft, you pick up a few mechanical skills. Though I did have help with the engine rebuild and some of the more complex systems. Lucky walked around to the other side of the aircraft, studying markings and details that had triggered decades-old memories. The victory marks, he said suddenly, pointing to small symbols painted near the cockpit. 5 kills. Captain Morrison got 3 of those in one day over Berlin. The crowd gathered around to look at the faded but still visible markings that recorded the aircraft's combat successes. To the younger pilots, these small symbols represented something they had only read about in history books. To Lucky and Maggie, they were reminders of friends who had fought and died in skies far from home. What happened to Captain Morrison? Asked one of the spectators. Lucky's expression grew somber. Shot down over Normandy, 3 weeks after D-Day. He bailed out behind enemy lines. We never saw him again. The sobering reality of what these aircraft represented settled over the crowd. These weren't just machines or museum pieces, but veterans of a conflict that had shaped the modern world. The Mustang standing before them had carried young men into combat, had been shot at by enemy fighters, and had played a role in one of history's most significant conflicts. How did you end up buying this particular aircraft? Asked the airport manager. Maggie's expression grew thoughtful. I never forgot her. Of all the aircraft I delivered during the war, Carolyn was the one that stood out. There was something special about the way she flew, the way she responded to control inputs. When I heard she was sitting abandoned in Montana, I had to have her. But the restoration must have cost a fortune, said one of the younger pilots. More than I care to think about, Maggie admitted with a laugh. But some things are worth more than money. This aircraft represents the best of what we were fighting for during the war. Freedom, democracy, the right to live without fear. She's a symbol of what young Americans were willing to sacrifice for those principles. Lucky had moved to the tail of the aircraft and was studying something that had caught his attention. Maggie, he called out, come look at this. The crowd followed as Maggie walked to where Lucky was pointing at some barely visible writing on the aircraft's vertical stabilizer. In faded letters almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look were the words for Lucky and the boys. You wrote that, Lucky said, his voice thick with emotion. Before you left Blyston. You wrote it on every aircraft you delivered to us. Maggie nodded, her own eyes growing misty. I wanted you boys to know that someone back home was thinking about you, praying for you to come back safe. It was a small thing, but it felt important at the time. The younger pilots stood in respectful silence, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than they had initially realized. This wasn't just about an old woman flying an old airplane. This was about sacrifice, dedication, and the kind of service that had helped win the most important war in human history. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the tarmac, more people continued to arrive at the scene. Word had spread throughout the airport community about the remarkable encounter between the WASP veteran and the World War II fighter ace. Mechanics left their work, pilots emerged from offices, and even some passengers from the commercial terminal had made their way outside to witness this extraordinary reunion. The younger pilot, who had been most vocal in his initial criticism, stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Mrs. Thompson, I owe you more than an apology. What I said earlier was not just rude, it was ignorant. I had no idea about the WASP program or what women pilots did during the war." Maggie studied his face for a moment, seeing genuine sincerity in his expression. "What's your name, son?" "Lieutenant Jake Morrison, ma'am. I fly F-35s for the Air Force." The irony was not lost on Lucky Peterson, who had been listening to the exchange. "Morrison?" he repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to Captain Bill Morrison?" Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "That was my great-grandfather. He flew P-51s during World War II, but he was killed in action. My family doesn't know much about what happened to him." Lucky and Maggie exchanged meaningful glances before Lucky spoke, his voice gentle but clear. "Your great-grandfather was the pilot who flew this very aircraft in combat. He was my wingman and one of the finest pilots I ever knew. This is his airplane." Jake stared at the Mustang in stunned silence, his hands trembling slightly as the full impact of Lucky's words sank in. The aircraft he had been mocking, the machine he had dismissed as an obsolete relic, had been flown by his own great-grandfather in some of the most dangerous skies in human history. "He flew this plane?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "For 6 months," Lucky confirmed. "From January to June 1944, he was credited with 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, all while flying Carolyn. He was one of the best natural pilots I ever saw, and one of the bravest men I ever knew." Maggie approached the younger pilot, her expression compassionate. "Jake, your great-grandfather was special. I remember him from when I delivered this aircraft. He had a way with machines, a natural feel for flying that you can't teach. From what I saw today, that gift runs in the family." "What happened to him?" Jake asked, though from Lucky's earlier comments, he already suspected the answer. Lucky's expression grew solemn. "We were flying escort for B-24s over Normandy about 3 weeks after D-Day. German fighters jumped us from above. Your great-grandfather broke formation to go after a Messerschmitt that was making a run on the bombers. He got the German, but took hits in the process. His engine was smoking and he was losing altitude fast." The crowd listened in respectful silence as Lucky continued the story that Jake's family had never heard in its entirety. He could have tried to make it back to England, might have made it too. But there was a damaged B-24 below us, crew bailed out over German territory. Your great-grandfather saw the German fighters coming back for another pass at the paratroopers. He went after them, Jake said, understanding in his voice. Yes, he did. Shot down 2 more Germans, protecting those bomber crews as they came down. But his engine finally quit and he had to bail out himself. Last we saw of him, he was floating down into German-held territory. We circled as long as we could, but we were low on fuel and had to head home. Jake wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by finally learning the details of his great-grandfather's final mission. The family was told he was killed in action, but we never knew the specifics. Maggie placed a gentle hand on the young pilot's shoulder. Your great-grandfather died a hero, Jake. He gave his life protecting other airmen. That's the kind of man he was, and from what I've seen of your flying skills, that courage runs in your family. But I insulted his airplane, Jake said, his voice filled with regret. I called it junk, said it belonged in a museum. You didn't know, Lucky said firmly. And besides, your great-grandfather would have gotten a kick out of seeing his grandson fly modern jets. He was always interested in new technology, always asking the mechanics about improvements and modifications. The airport manager, who had been listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward with an idea. Mrs. Thompson, would you consider giving Lieutenant Morrison a closer look at the aircraft? Maybe explain some of the systems his great-grandfather would have used? Maggie looked at Jake thoughtfully. Would you like that, son? I could show you how your great-grandfather would have operated this machine. Jake nodded eagerly, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine interest and respect. Yes, ma'am, I would be honored. As Maggie began to explain the various systems and controls in the Mustang's cockpit, A small crowd gathered around them. She pointed out the gun sight that Captain Morrison would have used to target enemy aircraft, explained the fuel management system that could mean the difference between making it home or ditching in the English Channel, and demonstrated the radio equipment that allowed coordination with other pilots in the formation. The biggest difference between this and your F-35, Maggie explained, is that everything here is manual. No computers, no automatic systems, no fly-by-wire controls. Your great-grandfather had to manage engine power, propeller pitch, fuel mixture, and about a dozen other variables while flying in formation and watching for enemy fighters. Jake listened intently, his respect for his great-grandfather's generation of pilots growing with each explanation. The idea that these men had flown complex combat missions with such primitive equipment began to give him a new appreciation for their skill and courage. "Would you like to sit in the cockpit?" Maggie offered. "Just to get a feel for what your great-grandfather experienced?" Jake looked at her in amazement. "Are you serious? You would let me do that?" "I think Captain Morrison would approve," Lucky said with a smile. He always believed in passing knowledge down to the next generation. As Jake carefully climbed into the cockpit where his great-grandfather had fought and died, the circle of spectators grew quiet. This was more than just a tour of a vintage aircraft. It was a connection across generations, a bridge between the past and the present that none of them had expected to witness on an ordinary afternoon at a small California airport. As Jake Morrison settled into the worn leather seat of the Mustang's cockpit, the same seat his great-grandfather had occupied during 32 combat missions, a profound silence fell over the assembled crowd. His hands rested lightly on the control stick, and his eyes swept across the array of analog instruments that seemed both primitive and magnificent compared to the digital displays of his F-35. "Can you feel it?" Lucky Peterson asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "The history, the spirits of all the men who flew these birds?" Jake nodded slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching reverence. "It's incredible," he whispered. "I can almost imagine what it must have been like, flying into combat with nothing but these basic instruments and raw courage." Maggie stood beside the aircraft, watching the young pilot with satisfaction. This was why she had spent years and countless dollars restoring the old fighter, not just to preserve a machine, but to preserve the memories and honor the sacrifices of those who had flown it in humanity's darkest hour. "Mrs. Thompson," said the airport manager, who had been thinking about the implications of what he had witnessed, "I hope you know that this aircraft will always be welcome at Riverside. In fact, I'd like to discuss setting up a permanent display area where people can learn about the WASP program and the role of aircraft like this one." "That's very kind," Maggie replied. But Carolyn wasn't meant to sit on display. She was built to fly, and as long as I'm able, that's what she continued to do. Lucky laughed, the sound carrying both joy and admiration. "That's exactly what you said in 1944. The mechanics wanted to put you in the officers' club where it was safe and comfortable, but you insisted on flying every mission they'd let you take." As Jake climbed down from the cockpit, his face showed a transformation that went far beyond simple respect. He had connected with his heritage in a way he never could have imagined, and the experience had clearly affected him deeply. "Mrs. Thompson," he said formally, "I would like to ask your permission to do something." "What's that, son?" "I'd like to arrange for my squadron to meet you and hear your story. We have young pilots who need to understand where they came from, who need to know about the sacrifices that made their careers possible. Would you be willing to speak to them?" Maggie smiled, pleased by the request. "I'd be honored, Jake. The WASP story is one that needs to be told. Too many people have forgotten about the women who served." One of the other younger pilots, who had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I have a question. After the war ended, what happened to the WASP? Did you continue flying?" Maggie's expression grew slightly sad. The WASP were disbanded in December 1944, before the war even ended. The government decided they were no longer needed. Most of us went back to civilian life, but many of us never stopped flying. I became a commercial pilot, then a flight instructor, and eventually started my own charter company. But it wasn't until 1977 that the WASP were finally recognized as military veterans. 33 years later, Lucky added, shaking his head. It was a disgrace how long it took for their service to be officially recognized. The crowd had grown even larger as word continued to spread throughout the airport community. Several people had their phones out, but now they were recording respectfully, understanding that they were documenting a historic moment rather than capturing entertainment. A local news crew had arrived and was setting up their equipment at a respectful distance. The reporter, a young woman who clearly understood the significance of what was happening, waited patiently for an appropriate moment to approach. "Mrs. Thompson," said one of the mechanics who had been working on the modern jets. "I've been around aircraft my whole life, but I've never met a WSP pilot before. What you ladies did during the war, flying without recognition or proper support, that took real courage." "We didn't think of it as courage," Maggie replied. "We thought of it as service. Our country needed pilots and we could fly. It was that simple." Lucky nodded in agreement. "That's what made the greatest generation great. They didn't think about themselves or their comfort. They saw what needed to be done and they did it, regardless of the personal cost." As the afternoon began to wind down, Jake Morrison made one final request. "Mrs. Thompson, would you autograph something for me? I'd like to have a reminder of this day." "Of course, son. What would you like me to sign?" Jake thought for a moment, then smiled. "Could you sign the inside of my flight helmet? Right where my great-grandfather's name would have been painted in his." Maggie took the modern helmet and carefully inscribed her name, along with a message, "To Jake Morrison, your great-grandfather would be proud. Keep flying with honor. Margaret Thompson, Wasp Blast 44-3." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached both Maggie and Lucky to thank them for sharing their stories and for their service. The younger pilots, who had begun the day with casual arrogance, left with a profound new respect for the history of their profession and the sacrifices of previous generations. The news crew conducted brief interviews, and within hours, the story of the WASP pilot and her reunion with the World War II veteran would be broadcast across the region. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the impact went far beyond what any television report could convey. As Maggie performed her final walk-around inspection of the Mustang before putting her away for the night, she reflected on the day's events. She had taken off that morning planning nothing more than a routine practice flight. Instead, she had been reminded once again why preserving these aircraft and these stories was so important. The old fighter would rest in her hangar tonight, her Merlin engine cooling in the California evening air. But tomorrow, if the weather was good and her 72-year-old pilot was feeling up to it, she would fly again. Because some things are too important to be left sitting on the ground, and some stories are too vital to be forgotten. The young pilots who had jeered at an old woman flying a Relic had learned a lesson they would never forget. Never judge a pilot by appearance, and never assume you know the full story of any aircraft you see. Sometimes the most extraordinary histories come in the most ordinary packages, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never thought of themselves as heroes at all.